These youngsters from Liverpool, England.
The significance is that the Beatles have held this title for 8 years.
My model of business is the Beatles. You know, they were four very talented guys.
Hello, I'm Jack, and you're listening to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast, an interview show about the Beatles' influence in the past, present, and future across the universe and across generations. It's been 58 years since the Beatles were greeted by over 3,000 screaming fans upon their arrival in America. On their first TV appearance in the United States, a record-shattering 73 million people tuned in to watch them perform on The Ed Sullivan Show. In the few months after that performance in 1964, the Beatles placed 28 records in the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart, and 11 of those made it to the top 10. Almost 20 years after, in 1981, the Beatles set another record for having the most albums in the U.S. charts simultaneously. They had 7 albums appear in the top 200 albums chart. And just 22 years ago, in the year 2000, the Beatles' album One became the best-selling album of the 2000s decade. And today, 30% of the Beatles' listeners on Spotify were born between the years 1996 and 2004. What makes the Beatles timeless? What makes them new for every generation? In an effort to explore this, I'm going to introduce today's guest. Today we're welcoming Robbie Fox onto the show. Robbie's 23 years old, and he's a blogger at Barstool Sports. He's the host of the podcast My Mom's Basement, and he's the bass player in the band Pop Punk. He's a great guy, so down to earth, and he loves the Beatles with a passion. So let's get right into it. Hey Robbie, thanks for coming on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I'm always down to talk about the Beatles, so I'm excited to do this.
Well, I'm excited to have you on, man. So for those who don't know, Robbie writes blogs about pretty much everything over at Barstool, from MMA events to music and the Beatles.
Exactly. Like, MMA is sort of the main thing that I'm expected to cover when there's UFC events or anything like that. Like, yes, I'm on that beat, but Barstool allows us the freedom to cover whatever we want. So when when I watch a crazy video and I'm like, oh my God, I've never seen that before, it doesn't matter what it's about. I could throw up a blog on the website about it and talk about it. So music is one of the things I love the most and wind up talking about the most on Barstool.
So, Robbie, let's start from the beginning. Let's give our listeners some background about you. Can you tell us how you grew up?
I grew up in Little Ferry, New Jersey. It's a very tiny, like 1 square mile town, like 14 miles, I think, from New York City. So it's pretty close. It's, near Hackensack in Bergen County, New Jersey. And yeah, it was a small town, didn't even have a high school, had to go to high school in a different town. But shortly after high school, got hired by Barstool. It was my first semester of community college and dropped out pretty quickly and kind of just took things from there. And that was like 5 years ago now.
So you must have been sending out applications while you were still in high school, right?
I had been applying since I was like 13 years old, literally just like incessantly emailing everyone at this company because I was a fan. I just thought, like, I saw the freedom that everyone is allowed to have and how they were kind of like, their job is to just talk about the stuff that they love. And I thought that looked awesome. Nobody covered MMA for this site at the time, and that is one of my loves. So I saw that as like a little hole to fill. And yeah, I got hired as an intern. Luckily, just time kind of hit perfectly where I graduated from high school at the exact time that they moved the company to New York.
Where was Barstool before that?
It wasn't even, they had like a tiny headquarters in Boston, but mostly everyone was still like blogging from their apartments. The company hadn't been like acquired by Chernin yet, so it was still like a smaller blog. Obviously it had a reputation, but it wasn't what it is today.
And what year did you start applying for Barstool positions?
Geez, that had to be, I think it was like 2014, 2013, or it was even earlier. I think it was 2011, the first email I ever sent, which is crazy because like the site was pretty small at that point. But I had older cousins who were in college at the time, and that was like their audience, like the college age students. So they introduced it to me really young, and I just started sending like t-shirt designs, sample blogs, sample podcasts, anything that I could do that I felt like fit something within Barstool. So yeah, and I think I was 18 when I first heard back, and I heard back when I was like 14, and they were like, dude, we can't hire a 14-year-old. But I was like, all right, that was my in. I heard back that so you're saying there's a chance. And then when I was 18, I got hired as an intern, and then like I got hired as an intern in October of 2016, and by February of that next year, I was hired full time.
That's awesome. Congratulations on the persistence, man. I love it.
Thank you.
So again, I'm just gonna say it again for those who don't know. Robbie, how old are you? You're 23 right now.
Yep, 23.
You're a young Beatles fan. How old were you when you started listening to the Beatles music, and how did you come to hear them?
I got into the Beatles super young. My family is like a pretty musical family. My uncle it was in a band growing up, and my brother's a drummer, so always rock and roll was just like a part of my life. And we had the blue Beatles greatest hits album. They had the blue one and the red one, the blue one being the later years, the red one being the earlier years. And whenever we were on a road trip, that was like the thing that I always wanted to listen to. It was just like I didn't like any of the other CDs that were in the car. It was just like the safe pick. Like I'm definitely gonna like all this stuff. So for years, that was like my Beatles exposure. Eventually, when they got like the music rights to go on iTunes, that was even a bigger like eye-opening experience for me, where I went through the entire discography, and I eventually started playing bass. Paul McCartney, obviously being someone who I want to learn from. So I started trying to learn all the Beatles songs, started getting the songbooks, started going on reading interviews, watching the documentaries, like really going in the deep dive. I would say when I was in eighth grade to like high school, that area, and now I'm a complete fanatic. I mean, the Beatles are part of like my everyday life. I feel like with just if you look at my Spotify, like most listen to, they're always in the top three. Constantly got their solo albums on. I have all the vinyls. I have, like you mentioned, the Get Back movie, the re-releases. Like I'm on top of all that stuff. So my next tattoo will also be a Beatles one that I'm planning right now. So I'll have that soon. I'm gonna get on the back of my arm like a photo booth strip, like when you go to the mall and you get like take a picture in the little strip, and in each panel, I'm gonna have a different Beatle in their Sergeant Pepper's getup. So I'm excited to get that. I don't have anything Beatles yet, and I'm excited to add something on here.
Are you gonna design that yourself?
No, I know I'm not that great an artist, but I have someone that I know through Barstool. They kind of do like cartoons and stuff for Barstool. That's gonna do it for me.
I see you also have a peace and love tattoo.
I do, yeah. Yeah, that's in my mother and grandmother's handwriting. So I do have a little like that's Beatles vibes.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's Ringo's big slogan. He always says peace and love. So, Robbie, what inspired you to take the deep dive into the Beatles' music around like 8th grade, you said?
It was big YouTube. Yep, it was when the music first went on iTunes. That was huge for me. Like I said, like I didn't have all the CDs, so I didn't have the access to it at the time before then. And I went to a Beatles exhibit. There was like an exhibit in the city, and I forget what year it was, but it was very small, and it was just they had a few pieces of memorabilia, handwritten lyrics from John or the Mellotron that he used this now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think they had, and they would play little, projections on the wall of their concerts, and that like completely, captured my imagination. And that was a big step for me being like, "Ooh, I want to learn more about this band." I wound up going and seeing Love the first time I went to Las Vegas. I have some family that lives out there. So the first time I was there, I was like, that's the only thing I'm interested in is like, let's just go do Love. And I was pretty young at that point. I want to say it was 2008 when I saw Love. So I was only 10 years old, and I was just like completely imagination captured.
So the show in Las Vegas had an influence on you?
Yeah, big time.
Did the Beatles have any influence on you applying to Barstool or even trying to get to where you are now? Because I know at one point in your life you wanted to be a rock star, and
Yeah.
so tell me how you switched career paths there.
Well, you know what? I feel like I had like a bunch of like I was one of those kids that like would get so into something and then I'd be like I want to be that. So like I wanted to be a rock star. I wanted to like maybe direct movies. That was a big like passion of mine for years. I'm a big Star Wars fan and stuff. So you would watch like the behind the scenes videos on that, and they would be as entertaining as the movies themselves to me, like the choreography behind the lightsaber fights or whatever. So I thought that was a dream. I wanted to be a professional wrestler. I trained in professional wrestling school for a bit. Like I had a bunch of random passions, and Barstool was kind of the perfect place for me to like put them all in one like melting pot where I felt like, oh, I could do this. I could go like we now have a band at Barstool where I could, dress up as a rock star and basically have these fake shows. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it's like, and we've done Beatles covers and pop punk. We've done Come Together. We've done Get Back. We've done Help. We did like the version of Help from Yesterday, the movie, which is a little more like punk rock. It's a cool version. So like doing stuff like that, Barstool was kind of the place where when it got on my radar, I was like, oh, I can like if I work here, I can kind of pursue a bunch of different things and talk about why I love all these different things. So I don't know if the Beatles necessarily influenced that, but they influenced me way more today. Like listening to their lyrics, I watch the George Harrison Scorsese documentary all the time. It's on HBO Max in the two parts. And it's just like that's like it could be my Bible at this point. Like that has made me yes, that's made me like a George guy. My whole life I felt like I was like, am I a Paul guy or am I a John guy? Am I Paul or am I John? And then I watched that like a couple years ago and I was like, oh no, I'm definitely a George Harrison guy. Like that's my Beatle right there. The quiet one, the way he looked at life. So like that influences me way more today than it did then.
So, do you take the George Harrison approach to your everyday life, like the spirituality and the detachment from society?
Sort of, yeah. Yeah. I'm not yet like in the spiritual realm. I don't do the Hare Krishna, I don't do the chants and stuff, but just more the live in the now, the more love one another, just very peace and love, not there for the drama. I love that about George. When you watch the video of John recording How Do You Sleep, which is obviously like it's like the first diss track or something to Paul or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, like the world's first diss track.
Yeah, and when you watch the video of that, like you could see it on George's face, like he doesn't want to be there. He's doing it because John basically tricked him into recording it with him, but he's just like, God damn, why are we fighting? Like this isn't right. And I love that.
Yeah, he was over the fame. He was over the exploitation of Beatlemania from like an early age. He didn't want to be a Beatle, you know?
Yeah.
He wanted to be a human. And anyone who tells me they relate to George, I automatically like because one, they know enough about George to know who he was
Yeah.
and to be able to relate to him. And two, well, because he was just super likable.
And yeah, just his kindness, like that's something that like I aspire to. The way that everyone talks about George nowadays. There's that story in the documentary that Ringo tells about like the last time that he saw George, and he was in bad shape with his cancer and everything. And Ringo's daughter was also in bad shape at the time, and Ringo said, "Oh, I'm going to go off to Boston to see her." And George was like, "Do you want me to come with you?" And George is basically on his deathbed, but he's that kind that he's like, I'll fly across the country or the world with you right now if you want. And like that's something that you look at and you go, man, I hope one day, 100 years from now, when I'm gone, like people look back and tell stories about me being a kind person. So that's like what influences me. I'm like, yeah, George is like someone we could all aspire to be.
When you started listening to the Beatles, you were pretty young. What did kids your age have to say about that?
It was definitely a weird thing. It still is. Like you said, we're 23, 24, and you say like, "Oh, I'm a huge Beatles fan." People are like, "Oh, yeah, sure you are. Drake has more bops than the Beatles. He's got the Abbey Road tattoo." And you're like, "No, stop it." But yeah, it was always kind of the weird thing. They're like, "What are you talking about? Yellow Submarine?" I remember that being such a thing when you're like kids. People are just like, "What, Yellow Submarine?" And you're like, "I guess that's one of their songs." Yeah, but like exactly, yeah. So I remember hearing that a ton. It's way more like you said now, like the resurgence in the last few years, it's way more easy to be a Beatles fan. There's accounts like Beatles Earth on Twitter where it's like it's just kind of a place where we could all like talk about the Beatles, retweet awesome clips, like the social media aspect of it is huge. It's awesome.
Did you ever feel like an outcast because of your music taste compared to kids your age? Or did you ever encounter anyone making fun of the fact that you listened to the Beatles?
It was like less with the Beatles and more with the other bands I listened to. I vividly remember being in seventh grade and being made fun of for listening to Green Day because it was that screamo shit. Like kids were saying like, "Oh, why do you listen to that screamo Green Day?" And it was like, "What are you talking about?" Like listen, nothing against screamo. I'll go listen to screamo. But Green Day's not screamo. They're like pop punk, alternative rock. Like there's even no even moments. Like I'll go listen to a Slipknot record right now, right in your face. But that's not what I'm listening to here. Yeah, like so I remember getting so frustrated with kids calling Green Day screamo, and then like getting to high school with them and seeing them walk in like a vintage washed American Idiot shirt and just being
Right.
like, no.
Isn't that funny? I know you're a fan of Star Wars,
Oh yeah.
and similar to how the Beatles are coming back into popularity with the Get Back documentary on Disney Plus, Star Wars also had that resurgence a couple years ago with the new trilogy.
Like everything coming back, yeah.
And one thing I noticed is that the people who were making fun of Star Wars fans a long time ago all of a sudden became fans. So what causes that conversion into being a fan?
Better late than never, them coming around on this stuff. I think it was just like I have an older brother and an older sister. My older brother's 12 years older than me, and my older sister's 9 years older than me. So growing up, it was very much like, and I loved that dynamic growing up because it was like I had a second set of parents that were like cool. Like I never fought with my brother or sister growing up. We were always cool because the age gap was just like, what, they're gonna fight with like a little kid? Like we got along so well and still do to this day. They're like my best friends. So I got introduced to everything through them. So like the Star Wars stuff, the Beatles stuff, that's all like through my brother and me basically being a little kid and him being like, I'm gonna mold my little brother's brain to be exactly like me so we could be friends growing up. And that was like how it all started and how it all like continued. Still to this day, my uncle that I told you about, who was in a band growing up, me, my uncle, and my brother are in a group chat. And we every day we just send each other clips, usually Beatles related, Zeppelin related, like old school rock and roll. So it all comes from like the family basically. And it's the best feeling when someone comes up to you nowadays and they're like, someone did this to me that I work with recently, and they were like, "Can you put together like a Spotify playlist of Beatles songs you think I might like?" Like I'm maybe starting to think, and I'm like, "Oh my God, yes, say no more!" Like running to my computer, like ready to do it. And it's like, and the Beatles are so great because, and this is one of the things that irks me the most. I'm glad like we're doing this because I get to say this. I haven't said this on a podcast before. When people say, "Oh, I don't like the Beatles," I'm like, it blows my mind because I'm like, okay, no, no, no. That's not true. You just haven't listened to them enough. Like, there is so much variety in the Beatles, and you could even expand it to their solo works. You could say Paul with Wings, George's solo stuff, even the Ringo solo stuff, John's. You could say like you don't like certain Beatles songs or you don't like the early Beatles stuff. I could hear someone saying that. You saying you don't like the Beatles is like saying you don't like music. Like, what are you talking about? There's so much variety. There's got to be a Beatles song you like. There has to be. So I like going in and like trying to find those songs with people.
Oh, dude, I've recommended so many Beatles songs to my friends. I'm like a Beatles missionary. And the cool thing is that you're right. The Beatles are so diverse. There's a song for everybody.
Yeah.
The other night, I actually had my friend over, and I was playing the Beatles on shuffle, and the first couple songs that came on were very classic Beatlemania songs. You know, She Loves You, Hard Day's Night, Can't Buy Me Love. And I could tell it wasn't really clicking with my friend. And then Happiness is a Warm Gun came on. And, you know, it's a heavier song, and I could see his ears perk up, and he started to get a little interested. And he was surprised when I told him we were still listening to the Beatles. They're so diverse, and they're everlasting. You know, a couple of bands from the 60s sound like they're from the 60s.
Yeah.
Take Cream, for example. You know, they have good songs.
Yeah.
Eric Clapton is a little controversial.
Yeah. Eric Clapton's making it hard to love Eric Clapton nowadays.
but there are not a lot of Cream songs I can listen to and think, okay, this will fit in on contemporary radio today. But with the Beatles, I feel like they still sound so contemporary.
Yeah.
So what is it about them that makes them infinite?
That's a friggin' great question that I'm not sure I have the answer to, but I think there's definitely an aspect of the mania surrounding both, like the Star Wars mania in the late 70s, early 80s, and Beatlemania, obviously, are part of the attraction to both, I think. Like the fandoms actually add to it. Like Beatles fans love the intricacies of what went into everything, just like Star Wars fans, like I mentioned, love the behind the scenes stuff. We love the fights. I mean, the Get Back documentary on Disney Plus, the perfect example. Like, I'm looking forward to that as much as I'm looking forward to the next Star Wars or Spider-Man coming next month, because it's like, oh my God, this footage that's been in a vault for 50 years or whatever is finally going to be unearthed. It's crazy to imagine that. So I think that is an aspect. But as far as the music itself, it's like they were the perfect four guys for it, the perfect mesh. What they were doing was magic. It's like I'm a huge Oasis fan. Oasis, one of my favorite bands of all time. And there's that period of Oasis between Definitely Maybe and What's the Story, Morning Glory, where everything they were touching was magic. Like Noel Gallagher could not write a song that was not amazing. Some of the best Oasis songs are B-sides from that era, like The Master Plan or like songs like this, that they would wind up like opening shows with, closing big gigs with, or B-sides because of that. And it's like the Beatles had that struck by lightning, but for like a decade. Like their entire existence was basically that amazing period. I don't know what it was, but like you said, they sound contemporary. Like to this day, you could put on Beatles albums, whether it be the remasters or not, whether it be the originals, and you're like, man, this sounds amazing. Some of the sounds that you hear on Sgt. Pepper's, you're like, man, the stuff that we praise, like Phineas for doing on Billie Eilish's stuff, production wise, like the Beatles were doing 50 years ago. It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, they were doing all of the same stuff 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And on top of that, they were only around for 7 years. 7.
Yeah, not even 10.
And then they ceased to exist. Yet here they are still. Let It Be was just re-released and it went to #1 in the charts.
Again, yeah. It's 2021 and it entered #1 again.
And I'm pretty sure the Abbey Road re-release did the exact same thing a couple years ago.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. Like their success never stops. I think Paul's a great PR man and always has been, promoting these recent events.
I was going to say they've done a great job with stuff like that too, like the re-releases, the way Paul promotes it, the way Ringo gets out and promotes it at this point. Like they really do a good job of keeping the fandom alive. Like I have the anthology. Boom, here it is. What a better thing to keep the entire legacy alive in the 90s than the Beatles anthology. I think it's like the greatest, music documentary you could ask for, the most comprehensive. And, you've got the shots of Paul driving the boat, which is just hysterical. You're like, why are you doing this interview driving a
right.
boat?
Why was he on the boat?
Yeah. But like, that's great. And the songs that they re-recorded for that, Free as Bird and stuff, where it's like, you have the songs that John wrote that they finished. Like, what better thing to promote the anthology than new Beatles songs in the 90s? Like, so that stuff, like Paul being a good PR man, that's definitely part of the reason why they are still as big as they are today.
It's funny you mentioned Free as a Bird. That song was actually controversial among fans in the 90s.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, even Prince was quoted saying that it was demonic.
They thought they were like exploiting the vocals.
Yeah, exactly. And some Beatles fans didn't like it because they felt like it wasn't the Beatles because John wasn't with them.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what side of that debate do you fall on?
See, I love it. Like, I love the lyric changes that Paul threw in there that are like literally tributes to John and stuff. Like, I think it's a beautiful symbol, and it wouldn't have been right maybe if Paul took that and put it out as like a Paul McCartney song. But the fact that it's put out as the Beatles and it's all of them on that recording, I think kind of does make it right. And maybe I'm not the right person to say that. It's up to Yoko. But Yoko was also the one who gave the box to Paul and was like, yeah, go for it. So I think they talked to Yoko about it. I think they talked to Sean about it. Those were the right people to do it. That's the circumstances, the people in the room. I felt like they did it with as much respect as you possibly could have asked for.
You mentioned Yoko. What's your opinion on Yoko?
I mean, you read everything nowadays. You watch the George documentary, you watch the Beatles anthology, and in my opinion, it seems pretty clear that Yoko was not the sole cause of the Beatles breakup. I think it was probably a little strange that John brought her around all the time, and probably the wrong move, considering bringing her to the studio caused a bit of a rift, but it was the death of their manager, Brian Epstein. It was the death of another friend that they mentioned, I feel like, or someone that worked for the band. It was the heroin addiction that was starting to get into the band. It was the rift between Paul and John. There were so many other factors, and it's a shame. You look at Yoko and like her legacy for decades was just like she ruined the Beatles. Still, people say like the Yoko Ono of blank, the Yoko Ono of blank, and she's kind of used as like a verb or they replace words with her name, and it's a shame. Like I walk into Central Park all the time, and Strawberry Fields, the Imagine mosaic there, and you see the Beatles buskers and people doing covers, and I love that. It's one of my favorite things to do in the city. I always think, I hope I see Yoko walking through here one day. Just like, I wouldn't even say anything. I would just like wave and smile, but like, she definitely doesn't deserve everything she's gotten, in my opinion.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I think they were grown men.
Yep.
They made their own choices. It's not right to blame Yoko for everything that happened,
Yep.
especially when she made John happy. And keep a lookout in Central Park, because you never know. One day I was showing some of my friends around the city. It was their first time there, and I wanted to take them to Strawberry Fields, so we went in Central Park.
Yeah.
And we accidentally passed the Imagine Circle, but we ran into Sean Lennon and Yoko Ono in Central Park.
That's crazy.
And I was in complete shock. But they were both super, super nice, and the nicest people you could ever imagine. And it was great. So keep trying.
That's royalty right there. Yeah, that's like, oh my God, I'd be more starstruck by them than anyone else. Basically, people say that all the time. Like with Barstool, like people, like famous people come into the office all the time. So they're like, who would like still make you starstruck? I'm like, if I saw Paul or Ringo, I think my soul would leave my body, and I would just like, it would be some kind of experience like I've never had before. Like how people describe ayahuasca, or like how Joe Rogan describes his crazy, jungle drugs.
Well, I hope you get to meet him one day. Have you ever seen him in concert?
Seeing them is still like on my bucket list. I've never seen Paul in concert. I've never seen Ringo in concert. And I'm like, I need them to announce a show. I'll go anywhere in the world at this point. Post-pandemic, it's like, YOLO. We only got one shot at this. I got to see them.
Yeah, or just start hanging around Central Park every day.
Yeah, I'll just have like a sign around Central Park. Beatles? Anyone?
Slowly turn into that lady from Home Alone 2 that lives in Central Park.
Yep, the bird lady, yeah.
I know that you've been pretty open about having anxiety and panic attacks.
Oh yeah, big time.
Have the Beatles helped you cope with that at all?
1,000%, like 10,000%. One of the main things for like, I have bad panic attacks still to this day. Not super often, every couple months maybe, but it feels like everything's closing in on you. The world is ending, and it's just a crazy sensation. It's a very physical feeling in your body. Sometimes you throw up, and for me, panic attacks are brutal. And one of the things is you do deep breathing. I like to put on soft music and just kind of like to calm myself down from the panic attacks. One of the main things that I say to myself during a panic attack is nothing's going to change my world. Across the Universe is like such a great song. I swear to God, this is 1,000% true. I was in Abu Dhabi for UFC fights at the beginning of this year, January. I had never been out of the country before in my life. I'm in Abu Dhabi now alone under COVID lockdowns, where I'm like locked in this room. We had barely any Wi-Fi. The TV had 8 channels, none of which were in English. So I just started freaking out. Something in my body said like, this is a situation we're not used to. Couldn't get in contact with like my friends and family because the Wi-Fi was so bad. So I just felt alone. And I swear to you, I just went in the shower. I put on Beatles playlist. And as soon as Across the Universe came on, something hit me where I was like, nothing's going to change my world. Nothing's ending here. Everything's going to be all right. And now whenever something comes over me where I feel anxiety, I feel anxious, I just say that to myself, nothing's going to change my world. We're good. So literally, yes, the Beatles do help my anxiety to this day. That's something I might get tattooed on me one day. I've thought about that.
I'm extremely happy you have the Beatles as a way to cope with anxiety and panic attacks, because it's not easy dealing with that. And
it's tough. Yeah, it feels like it's such an overwhelming sensation.
I'm happy for you. I truly am.
Thanks, man.
And I was wondering, is there any specific subject that gives you anxiety or panic attacks?
Not necessarily. I mean, certain times things will come up. Initially, when we first started doing like the pop punk shows, like that was a very anxiety inducing thing for me. Getting on stage and playing in front of people, I was like, this is not something that I thought I could do. Now that's easy peasy. Like it's become a thing that I'm so used to, and I don't even really get jitters before the shows anymore. I just get really excited. So like certain things, when they come up, when new unexpected things come up, that would give me anxiety. For years it was just like doing anything, doing interviews, doing podcasts, that I like couldn't do it for a bit. I'm on anxiety medication now. I take my Lexapro and I'm all good.
There's another similarity between you and the Beatles. Paul used to get really bad stage fright, along with Ringo. I've also read that John used to throw up before some of the shows because of how bad his stage fright was.
Wow. That's crazy, and it's crazy, but at the same time, it's not. You could understand it when they had the reputation that they had for being the best in the world. He knows every concert's going to be someone's first Beatles show. They expect the best. They expect, perfection, nothing less. It's got to be that the pressure's got to weigh on you at that point.
Robbie, do you wear those glasses while you're playing on stage?
I do, yeah. Yeah.
I think that John would not wear his glasses on stage.
And he didn't wear them. I know, and it was so blurry. I remember reading that story and being like, God, I could not do that. I am not good enough at playing the bass to like know where I'm looking without my glasses. I am blind as a bat without them.
Yeah, I mean, I think John did that because he didn't want to get the stage fright by looking at everyone in the crowd.
Oh, really? That's a decent idea, but yeah, I wouldn't be able to play. So that would be my dilemma. I remember before our first show ever, our first show was at Irving Plaza, which if you're like a New York person, you probably know is like a venue. I went up seeing my favorite bands there growing up, and pop punk bands and stuff. So that was like, oh my God. And we sold it out. So I knew it was going to be like a big crowd there. So I was like, this is our first show. I've never played more than 5 songs at a time with my middle school band. Like, so this was just crazy. And I remember my brother saying to me, maybe just don't face the crowd. He's like, maybe you could go out and you just face your amp on stage and that'll be your thing. You're like the bass player that doesn't face the crowd. And of course I did not follow that advice because that would look ridiculous. But that was like the mindset I was going through before. And it's kind of like the John thing. Like, don't even look at the crowd.
Now, did you decide to pick up the bass because of Paul McCartney?
It wasn't necessarily because of Paul. I picked up the bass because of the more theatric bass players like Gene Simmons and Nikki Sixx and Duff McKagan. Like the almost like the hair metal era of bass players got me into it because that's what my brother's favorite band ever is Motley Crue, and he's a drummer and he was very much like a Tommy Lee style drummer. He actually got credited on like some of Tommy's albums for like throwing some stuff in there and stuff. So it was all like, I want to be Nicky, he wants to be Tommy, so we could be Motley Crue up here. But then obviously you start to learn a thing or two about the bass, and you're like, okay, half of what Nicky's playing it comes from his Paul influence, so I should go back and learn some of the Beatles stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can name any musician, and they all trace their roots back to the Beatles and what Paul McCartney did with his bass lines.
All of them. It's crazy how much you could trace it back, and I mean to the level where Motley does. They have a Helter Skelter cover on "Shout at the Devil," and they have on a song called "Slice of My Pie." Literally, they just rip off "I Want You, She's So Heavy," and they finish that song with like the exact same riff. It's on Dr. Feelgood. It's worth a listen because it's cool. It sounds like demonic in a Motley Crue song. It sounds really cool. So like everything. It's crazy how much you could trace everything back to the Beatles. Guns N' Roses is another one. Like Axl has so much Paul influence in the way he sings and writes melodies.
Yeah, Guns N' Roses paid tribute with their cover of Live and Let Die.
Live and Let Die, yeah, classic.
And then Green Day paid their tribute with their cover of Working Class Hero.
That was big when that came out. I remember watching them perform that on American Idol. I like have a vivid memory of like them doing that on American Idol. And of course they couldn't say the one F-bomb because they were on American Idol. I remember thinking like, they ruined it. This isn't punk anymore.
Right. I love those punk moments in rock history. Like on Ed Sullivan when the Doors were singing Light My Fire and Ed Sullivan told them not to sing the lyric, Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher. And they sang it anyway. And Jim Morrison looked right in the camera when he sang it.
Oh, I didn't even know that story.
Like that was one of the first punk rock moments. Do you describe yourself as punk rock? Is that your personality?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I love punk rock. I don't know if I'd describe myself as punk because I don't know, I'm a bit of a wimp. I feel like I'm not like, I don't embody the punk rock spirit of like Nikki Sixx diving into the crowd with his bass to like beat up someone. Like that ain't me. But like, you know what? We played a show at House of Blues Boston and I tried to fight someone in the crowd. So yeah, sure. I'm going to describe myself as punk.
So pop punk, for everyone who's listening who doesn't know you guys, tell us when you started.
We started, I think it was the summer of 2017, and it was just an idea to be like a comedy music video. Like we almost had the idea. I'm such a huge fan of that era of music, the Blink-182, All Time Low, Green Day, like just all of those pop punk bands I'm really into. And I was sitting across from guy I work with, Roan, who is now the front man of pop punk, and he is a battle rap champ. Like the legit, if you look up Roan battle rap, you'll be like, oh my god, this is 8 Mile in real life, and he is frying people. So he's a world champion battle rapper. Listening to me listen to pop punk, and he was like, we should make one of those music videos where we're like stuck at our locker and we're really angsty about our parents. How funny would that be? And I said that would be hysterical. And afterwards, we'll film a VH1 behind the music about how we broke up after one song, and that'll be like the big bit. And I play the bass. He's like, I'll sing. I'll do that pop punk Tom DeLonge voice. We have a guy, PFT Commenter, who plays the guitar, and he's tremendously talented at it. And we had a drummer in the company. So we were like, all right, let's do it. We record the one song. It's called Back to School. The music video's on YouTube. And then we were going to record the behind the music. People were like, when's the next song drop? They kept saying, like, when's the next song coming out? And we were like, all right, maybe it would be foolish to just like throw this in the garbage can. Let's record another song. And we just kept recording songs. We don't even have that many now. We have like 5 or 6, but our shows will play like 4 originals and then like 16 covers, and they're covers of a bunch of songs that everyone knows. We scatter in the originals in the set list, so there are little breaks in the set, and it's a blast now. Like, it's just like probably my favorite thing we do at Barstool, because when you're on stage and you have this crowd, and this crowd would never like, it would never be this big just to see like us strictly based on our music and our talent, but we have the Barstool reach, so people are there to see like the Barstool guys play music or whatever. It feels like it's Guitar Hero in real life. It's pretty cool.
I just want to say I loved your band's music video for your song My Real Girlfriend. I thought that was...
Well, that's a Beatles tribute, of course. Yeah, we did the Ed Sullivan thing where we had Dave introduce us. We have literally their shots from their Ed Sullivan performance in that music video. The shots of the crowd are from the Beatles. That was that was definitely something that came from my brain that I pitched. I was like, can we do the Ed Sullivan thing? Because Nirvana did that too. They did like, I think it was for the In Bloom music video. They all dress up and they put the guitars real high up, and they do and I was like, that would be so funny if we did that, and we did the pop punk logo as the Beatles. That's like now basically the main logo we use is our logo of the Beatles font.
Do you guys have any plans to record an actual album of your songs?
I would love to. We don't have one like in the works or anything, but that's like number one on my dream list is like 2022, get in the studio for a week and crank out, a full album, maybe re-record some of the songs we've put out, because the recordings are like, I mean, we literally did it as like a joke at first. So we recorded the first song in someone's apartment, and they didn't even have like Pro Tools or anything. I think it's mixed on GarageBand. And the second song we we recorded in like this back attic studio that we found. It's like on 8th Ave. We found it on like Craigslist, and it's like built into a family's kitchen. This guy just like built a little studio. So there's like programmed drums on that, and like we would love to re-record some of the stuff for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty memorable experience.
It was very memorable. We were like cutting those absurd lyrics with very vulgar phrases while like a family was like eating dinner.
Do you write the lyrics?
I throw in lines. It's mostly Roan and PFT, the guitar player. So it's mostly them, and then like I feel like every verse I'll throw in a line or two.
Have you ever tried to write your own song?
I haven't. I would love to, but I'm a bass player, so it's hard to like start.
So you write your own bass lines then?
Yeah.
Is Paul McCartney an influence while you write those?
I was gonna say I'd like to say he is, but like that would be an insult to Paul because I'm very not good at the bass. I feel like my influence is very still like the Nicky Six Mark Hoppus style of a lot of root notes. I play with my fingers, so that's more of a Paul thing than a them thing, like I guess. But yeah, I would say it'd be an insult to Paul to say he influenced me. I wish. Maybe one day if I continue playing, but it still is like we practice like 3 times a year, maybe. And we have these shows that just come up. Like we just played 2 back-to-back shows in Denver and Bloomington. And that was our first shows in 2 years because of the pandemic and stuff. But we got that on a week notice. They were like, hey, 2 shows next week. We were like, okay, well, we haven't practiced in 2 years, so let's go relearn all of our songs. So it's very like slapped together, literally. So if I ever had more time to become a better bass player, my style would be influenced by Paul. Yeah.
So your band hasn't played live in 2 years, and then you guys just had a show?
We hadn't. No, almost 2 years. Yeah.
That sounds pretty similar to the plot line of the Get Back documentary.
Kinda. Yeah. Like getting back together. Like we got to perform the first show in years.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the documentary.
I cannot wait. I'm so excited for this. Like I watched the trailers on my TV. Like when the trailer drops, I'm like, oh no, I can't watch this on my phone or the computer. It'd be an insult to this. So I'm gonna boot up the YouTube app on my TV, watch it full screen, like volume cranked all the way up. I think the footage looks amazing. It looks like everything Beatles fans have ever wanted. And the fact that Peter Jackson was initially going to release it as a movie, and then he's like, no, there's too much footage. So now it's like a 3-part docu movie, and now it's like 6 hours long or whatever. That just makes me more excited because I look at the George Harrison doc, which for years I would look at it on Netflix and it said like 4 hours long, and I just didn't watch it. I was like, 4 hours? That's so daunting. Who has 4 hours? And now I'm like, oh no, give me 6 hours. I want the uncut version of that because I can't stop watching. So like, yeah, I'm definitely anticipating this movie a lot.
Have you heard the Let It Be album re-release?
I did.
What did you think of that?
I'm not. I listened to it and I was like, I'm not musically keen enough or whatever. Like, I'm not educated enough to like listen to it and be like, here's what they changed, here's what they didn't, here's what's different. I like the remaster. I listened to remasters and I'm like, yeah, it kind of sounds like the original to me.
So what'd you think of the bonus tracks?
Loved it all. All of that I love. I love when they put out like the BBC. You could find on YouTube. There's so many of like the BBC recordings where you could hear them. It sounds like you're sitting in on like a rehearsal session when you could hear them chattering and stuff. So that I love. Like I'm all down. I'm all for that.
Is anyone else at Barstool as into the Beatles as both you and I are?
We do have a couple. We have a couple Beatles fans at Barstool. Chaps is probably the biggest. Chaps named his child McCartney, and actually has like the yellow submarine like from the cartoon tattooed on his arm. So I would say me and Chaps are probably like 1 and 2 as far as Beatles fans at Barcelona. And you might put him at 1 because I feel like you get the ink and you name your child after one of the Beatles. That's some deep fandom right there.
Is he our age?
No, he's a bit older. I think he's like late 30s, early 40s. So he grew up in a different era for sure, but like again, like they reach all eras.
So you're big into movies.
Yeah.
You love movie reviews. I'd love to hear your favorite Beatles movie.
It's Hard Day's Night for me. It's Hard Day's Night, and I like Foo Fighters are one of my favorite bands, and Paul just inducted them to the Hall of Fame and everything. They just announced their first movie. It's like a horror comedy, and it's being described as A Hard Day's Night of the Living Dead, and that like makes me so excited because Hard Day's Night is something that I could throw on whenever. That's another thing. Like if I'm feeling anxious or having a panic attack, and I threw that movie on, like it's just such a good time that could snap you out of it. It's on HBO Max now, which has been great because that, like, I've rewatched it a ton since it went on HBO Max because it's just so easy to throw on while I'm working, while I'm doing something else, while I'm cleaning, throw on a Hard Day's Night, have it on in the background.
Do you actively recruit people to listen to the Beatles and show and share their music with everyone?
Oh, yeah. I'm incessant about trying to get everyone into the Beatles. I used to live with someone from Barstool before I moved in with my girlfriend, and I was constantly like, he's sitting on the couch. Let me throw on the anthology and see if it just, if he starts looking over. Like he was one of the people that said, like, why don't you make me a playlist of the songs that I might like? And Trent from Barstool is now like getting into the Beatles, and he's very into everything post Rubber Soul. He doesn't like the early stuff. He's like, that's a little too, I don't know, Chuck Berry for him. But everything post Rubber Soul, kind of the softer, more acoustic stuff, he's way into. So I was like, yes, I've converted a Beatles fan. He got really into George's solo stuff, which I sent him because All Things Must Pass is my favorite Beatles solo album. So I was like, oh my God, you must listen to this. This is like literally a holy album for many people. And he was like, oh yeah, this is the shit.
Oh, and what a way to start a solo career, right?
Oh my God.
Went right to #1 after years of having his songs rejected by John and Paul.
The best way to start a solo career. And another album that feels modern when you listen to it today. You listen to some of those songs and you're like, oh my God, this is like so out there but so perfect, and it has that familiar sound, has George's voice, has that guitar playing, that iconic guitar, those lines that he would write. So like I can't get enough of that album. That's also always in my constant rotation.
Last question I have for you today.
Okay.
It might be the hardest. What's your favorite Beatles album, and tell me why?
It's one of the hardest ones. probably go with the White Album because of the variety, how long it is. I think I would go White Album. That could change day to day, though. That's the hardest one to answer. Sergeant Pepper's is also really up there for me.
Does it change with what's going on in your life and what,
Oh yeah,
like, your
big time.
surroundings and stuff?
Big time. Oh yeah, there's not a Beatles album that I don't love. I have every single Beatles vinyl sitting beside me.
Okay, one actual last question for you. We touched on how the Beatles are having this explosion of popularity 50 years after their last album was released. Can you describe where society will be in 25, 50 years from now, and where the Beatles will be in relation to that?
I honestly firmly believe they're going to be exactly where they are right now, pop culturally, mainstream attention, if not, bigger, getting more attention because people like you and me, when we eventually have kids, when we have nieces, nephews, whatever, we're going to pass this stuff on just like our parents did to us and their parents might have done to them, depending on how old you are. Like, the Beatles are such a generational family thing. It's such a fandom of families and stuff like that that I don't see their legacy dying out anytime soon. I think, we're going to be celebrating 100-year anniversaries of Beatles albums. That's going to be like a big thing. It's going to be by the 100-year anniversary remaster of Let It Be. And that's going to be like an actual thing in our lifetime. And I think it's going to be a big thing. I think it'll skyrocket right back up to #1 on whatever platform we're, listening to music on then. It might just be some kind of like telekinetic thing.
Right. And I'm sure that 100-year Beatles remaster might just kick pop punk's 50th anniversary remaster off the #1 position in the charts.
I hope so. So I could get the future digital NFT screenshot of our albums next to each other.
Sell it to Paul's great-great-grandson.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Robbie, thanks so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it. Hope to have you back sometime.
Of course. Thanks for having me. This was a blast. I love talking about the Beatles. Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, and like you said, people our age, it's kind of hard to find people to talk about the Beatles with so in depth. So this was a blast for me.
And that brings us to a close on our second episode. Thanks again to Robbie Fox for coming on the show. Be sure to follow Robbie, check out his podcast, My Mom's Basement, and follow his band, Pop Punk. The links to everything will be in the description of this podcast. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to rate this episode and subscribe so you can get a notification whenever we upload a new episode. Follow us on Twitter @BeatlesEarth and check out our website, BeatlesEarth.com.